Well, hello and welcome to another edition of Brain Trust Conversations in Clinical Psychopharmacology. I'm Dr. Joe Goldberg, clinical professor of psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our ongoing series of casual dialogues and discussions with key figures in clinical psychopharmacology to make us aware of what's cutting edge and what's important for those of us who treat patients and want to be very up to date in clinical psychopharmacology. So I'm really thrilled that our guest today is a longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Guy Goodwin. Dr. Goodwin is Chief Medical Officer at Compass Pathways. He is Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Oxford in Oxford, UK. His research interests have been in the treatment of bipolar disorder and the application of neuroscience and understanding the neurobiology of mood disorders with a focus on developing new treatments. And his current interest is the potential to transform treatment using new technology and new drugs, notably psychedelics, which is what we're here to talk about today. Dr. Goodwin is a fellow of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. He's also previously held the position of president of the British Association for Psychopharmacology and has been president of the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology. So, Guy, welcome to our program today.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's great to be with you.
Wonderful. So, Guy, you used to be a bipolar researcher guy, and now you're doing something else. Tell us about the trajectory of your evolution professionally and research-wise.
Well, there is a certain shift there, I have to confess. It really came about because I'd effectively retired, and I was a bit gloomy about that. I sort of lost a role, and I got the opportunity to go full-time into a new position with Compass Pathways to develop psilocybin. And I'd been interested already. I'd advised a little bit on how to design with others the phase 2 clinical trial that we may go on to talk about. And at the time that I did that, I was a little pessimistic about whether there was really a future in that because it looked quite hard to raise money. It looked quite difficult to do the studies. So, there were a lot of things that seemed to me potentially difficult, but, there's a sort of many of these obstacles have become overcome by the people at Compass. And so I was able to join them in 2021. And, that was my, having failed retirement, that was the beginning of a new life.
Now, of all the things you could have done by way of innovative directions in novel therapeutics, what was it about psychedelics that drew your interest most?
Well, I've always been serotonin interested. And serotonin really got started with the psychedelics. I'm sure you're aware, if we go back to the discovery, the definitive discovery in 1943 by Albert Hofmann, the discovery of LSD was, of course, the first psychedelic. And that drug was the stimulus to understanding serotonin metabolism and function, both in the brain and to a lesser extent in the peripheral nervous system. So my interest in serotonin had always meant that I was interested in LSD, and I had taken LSD as a student, so I had a sort of personal, I wouldn't say I was not particularly someone who was changed particularly by that experience, but I was very struck by the fact that this was a powerful effect on consciousness, on the mind. And in a way, it was a kind of proof, if you needed one, that psychopharmacology had to exist. That we had drugs that had direct effects on experience. And so in a sense, that meant that we had to be dealing with, at its base, a chemical machine. And in a sense, all psychopharmacologists kind of have that bias that they want to help patients by using drugs that modify function in the brain. And that is our interest, and so it was very hard not to be interested in, for me anyway, in the serotonergic agonists, these drugs that all act in rather similar ways through the serotonergic system to produce this very profound change in consciousness. I think what I hadn't been aware of was the clinical potential, because my generation, because we couldn't access these drugs except in a purely recreational and strictly illegal sense, couldn't work on them. And so, in a sense, we lost the folk memory that these drugs had actually been useful and had been used more widely, I think, than we understood to treat patients with a range of disorders, but notably mood, anxiety, and also the addiction. So, that sort of rediscovery is something I think we probably all made in the last decade.
Now, in my youth, was at the University of Chicago. One of my old mentors was Danny X. Friedman, and he was a proponent of psychedelics as an adjunct to psychotherapy, if I remember correctly, is one of the initiating features of why would these molecules be of interest. So my question for you is, when you think about the psychedelic experience that I think people like Dr. Friedman had spoken about in the late 60s and thereafter, as a facilitator for the psychotherapy process, as opposed to what nowadays some people say is it's about neuroprotection. It's about the changes in the brain. And I'm sure you're going to say it can be both. But do you have a sense or an opinion about whether that older Friedman-esque view of facilitate the psychotherapy through the psychedelic experience as opposed to the neuroplasticity in the brain is more the driver?
Well, yeah, I think there was a historical division in that when LSD was introduced, it was generally used at relatively low doses, and so patients remained pretty much able to communicate through the experience. Now, people must have crossed into points where patients were much less in touch with the person who was sitting with them, but certainly the way in which Sandoz originally promoted the drug for limited use, admittedly, was as an aid to psychotherapy. And it was really the discovery of in Canada where they used higher doses in an attempt, and this was Humphrey Osmond, famous British psychiatrist, famous anyway among the psychedelic community. He essentially tried to simulate the extreme states of delirium tremens using high doses of LSD. And of course, that didn't produce the aversive effect that he was looking for, because at the time, aversion therapy was quite the thing. A little out of fashion now, it has to be said. But it was the idea that this would produce something that would deter patients through its adverse effects
Hmm.
was the way they used, and obviously in those, they were not thinking then of psychotherapy. But what they found, of course, was that people had this deeply immersive experience that wasn't necessarily negative, and that seemed to result in a surprising, to them, surprising number of patients who were able to quit drinking heavily and even quit smoking. And these observations were made and are said to have influenced the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. So, these were effects that were pretty impressive clinically. And I think that dichotomy between the deep, the profound experience, the immersive experience that in a sense takes the patient into a personal realm where the therapist is really not there to do therapy, but is there in a sense to look after the patient and make sure they're safeguarded because they're
Mhm.
potentially vulnerable. I think those two different traditions are there really from quite early in the use of the drugs. Now, of course, when the drugs essentially became inaccessible, we failed to develop them using conventional modern psychotherapy research techniques or indeed psychopharmacological techniques. So, we're now still fighting that out. And there's a lot of confusion, I think, honestly, about the way in which we have used in our development of psilocybin and how, for example, MDMA, which is a very different experience for patients, how that has been developed. And I think getting clear about whether psychotherapy is a necessary component of treatment, in particular, whether it's necessary if you're trying to prove to the regulatory authorities that your drug is a drug,
Yes.
that's pretty important, because clearly if you go to the FDA saying we're assisting psychotherapy, that clearly is a bigger ask for them to really understand and to approve. And that's sort of unfortunately played out for Lycos, as I'm sure everyone listening to this may or may not
The
be aware.
MDMA story.
But the FDA sent them a rejection, which was obviously very demoralizing for everyone who's interested in this area. But we think that in a sense, there's a different issue where one's using high doses of either psilocybin, LSD, or some of the shorter acting drugs, in that essentially it's not a therapeutic opportunity while the drug is on board. Any therapeutic opportunity sits after the drug has been on board and in the
Mhm,
clinical
mhm.
management of the patient in subsequent months and indeed perhaps years.
So if I could press you on the serotonin story for a moment further, uh, do you think that the concept of these drugs being neuroprotective has been a latter day development to add to the narrative as opposed to saying it's really all about the psychedelic experience, whatever's causing it? you need that psychedelic experience because I understand there are some companies that are trying to develop synthetic analogs that don't involve a psychedelic experience and are just really going after neuroprotection. Can you parse the distinction of neuroprotection and the psychedelic experience itself?
Yeah, I think the neuroprotection story grows out of animal and in vitro studies of neurons, and the idea that you can see changes that are persisting after a single acute administration, and that these are in pathways that have been implicated in the actions of serotonin, for example, due to the SSRIs. So the idea that you're getting changes in synaptic structure, that you're getting release of a variety of chemicals downstream from the serotonergic system that are involved in neuroprotection, in the repair of neuronal function. That is a strong idea coming from animal research. The difficulty with that, of course, is that the translation in psychiatry from animal findings to human findings has not been sensationally successful. And this could be an example where it is. And the test of that will be whether these compounds that seem to have these effects in animals without necessarily activating the 5-HT2A receptor in a way that produces psychedelic effects, whether that's possible, remains to be proved because at the moment it's largely theory and it's largely depends upon animal models.
Now, here's a hard question that I have never felt I've had a satisfactory answer to. So I'll ask you, I may have even asked you this before, but if the premise with the pharmacodynamic properties of a psychedelic is 5-HT2A agonism, is that not at variance with the antidepressant effects of 5-HT2 antagonists from atypical antipsychotics with antidepressant properties, or drugs like mirtazapine or nifazodone or trazodone, where we presume it's the antagonist of that receptor? How do you wrap your head around this sort of very fancy question of is it the agonism or the antagonism, or we don't know at that receptor?
I think we have to say that there isn't a straight line. You can't draw a straight line from the 5-HT2A receptor to mood. It goes through a complex, basically a network of synaptic connections, which we don't fully understand. I suppose that also goes along with the fact that if that is true, then we would expect there to be common effects and different effects. And I think there's the beginning of work to prove that. But some of the effects, for example, on the reactivity in the amygdala, go in opposite ways as well. So it's like you can get an antidepressant effect by livening up the amygdala, or you can get an antidepressant effect by damping it down. And of course, Robin Carhart Harris has written about this and tried and basically said, this is the contrast. These are different mechanisms of action with a common pathway somewhere, which we don't yet understand, that takes us to reduction of depressive symptoms in patients with depression, which is where the most of the work has been done clinically. Do I understand how that happens? No.
Well, you're an august company. I've yet to speak with any learned colleague who has, I think, a clarity on this, other than the empirical observation that this does seem to be beneficial. I guess it does raise questions, though, about if one was going to contemplate combination therapies at some point, if and when this is a molecule that makes its way into practice, you probably wouldn't want to combine this drug with a 5-HT2A antagonist. I would imagine mirtazapine is not a good pairing with psilocybin or really any atypical antipsychotic. Ought to undo the antidepressant effects if we think that mechanism is operative.
Yeah, I mean they appear to antagonize the.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean you can block the effect of psilocybin or LSD with a drug like ketanserin, which binds to the 5-HT2A and C receptors. So you've got evidence there. Giving those 5-HT2 blocking drugs, apart from ketanserin, I don't think people have looked at in detail. We have started to get interested in adding onto SSRIs where there isn't the same contradictory effect. In other words, you see largely preservation of the psychedelic effect, and you don't see extra toxicity, which of course would have been a concern in advance when one started thinking about adding drugs together, because that's going to happen in real life, as you can imagine.
This is actually a very important point you're raising. So you published a paper a few years ago in Psychopharmacology showing that if you were to combine psilocybin with an SSRI, you don't get a diminution of efficacy. I think Robin Carhart Harris, who you mentioned before, takes a different view, which is that why would you want to combine an SSRI with another serotonergic drug like psilocybin? Do you think, who knows? We'll see. I mean, if when this drug comes out, once the regulatory folks have their say, should clinicians be thinking pharmacodynamic logic? I got to be really careful what I might combine this with, but an SSRI
Yeah.
is or isn't okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be preferable in a sense to use this drug in the absence of other drugs. I mean, by and large, we think that's a simpler situation. But what we have seen, as you just alluded to, was this relative apparent preservation of the psychedelic effect and also the therapeutic effect. And what was also interesting was there's an experimental study that Matthias Lichty did a number of years ago, which showed that when you gave escitalopram to healthy volunteers, the psychedelic effect, the positive effects of psilocybin were not affected, but the negative effects, the anxiety effect, was actually somewhat reduced.
Hmm.
And of course, that would be one way in which is one of the at the moment the side effects of the drug that we don't particularly like is the fact that it may induce anxiety in maybe 20% of the patients who get the full dose. That if that were less, that would obviously be potentially a clinical advantage. Now, we're not going to be able to work out before the drug is widely available how to use these drugs. This is something that's going to be a clinical challenge. And there's certainly going to be combinations that come about either by chance or by design that will inform us. But so far, it would appear that one potential advantage could be that reduced anxiety. And if you get reduced anxiety, you may also get reduced increases in blood pressure, which is the only other thing that we have to be concerned about in giving these drugs to people.
Ah. All right, so let's pretend that you and I find each other on an airplane flight. And I'm a colleague, but I don't know very much about psychedelics, but I want to learn more. And you're seated next to me, and I have the aisle, you have the window, so there's no escape. And you tell me what you do for a living, and I tell you what I do for a living. And I say, oh, so you know about psychedelics. What should I, as someone who's knowledgeable, but not that familiar with psychedelics, know in our short flight from New York to Boston? What is it you would like to tell me about psychedelics for depression during our flight?
I think most people don't really seem to realize that we are getting quite close to approval if all goes well for the program that we have been conducting for the last 6 or 7 years. That is not widely understood. I think it's not widely understood what is required for approval. So the fact that you need a careful program that shows that you can create the drug safely and produce a drug that is stable. So you have chemical challenges which have been solved. You have a dose that has been more or less worked out, which is the starting dose for patients.
25
And
milligrams?
25 milligrams is probably the minimal effective dose. And so we've been able to do trials in a phase two, so-called, and also in phase three, the later stage of drug development. And the two trials that we're doing in the later stage will be wrapping up in the coming year or so. And so that is kind of giving you a sort of timestamps for when there's going to be the potential for approval by the FDA. So
Wow.
it's not so far off. And I would want people to understand that, and also to understand that these although these drugs are have to be delivered in a hospital setting with certain rules around the delivery of the drug, that will be possible because we already have an exemplar for this kind of treatment, which is esketamine, pardon me.
Yes.
And that is something that is quite important to understand because those facilities in the US have developed really only in the last few years. Prior to that, it would have been very difficult to imagine how this kind of treatment would be delivered.
All right. So now pretend I'm the depressed patient and I come to my clinician a few years from now and I say, so I read somewhere on Reddit that if I take a single dose of quality psilocybin, at least 25 milligrams, I can expect that I will be depression free for the next half year. I read that on Reddit. Is that an accurate distillation, or that's not quite accurate? What would that conversation be to the
I
patient?
think I think it's clear for the patient what the patient needs to understand that is at the moment our understanding of our own data is that some patients have exactly that experience. They have a very rapid reduction of their chronic symptoms, and these are patients who have failed other treatments, at least two, given for an adequate time and with adequate supervision. These patients often have been ill for at least 3 years in many cases. And these patients show a minority, but nevertheless an important minority, show a very acute resolution of symptoms, and that resolution lasts a very long time. Now, we can't
One
say
dose. One dose.
one dose, and that's the data that comes from our phase 2 study, but also from the studies of Robin Carhart-Harriet's group in London, and indeed other groups in the US, particularly at Hopkins, who have studied major
Mhm.
depression and the USONA group. So we clearly have evidence that these effects can be long lasting. Now, are they long lasting for everybody? Not so. They are not long lasting for everybody. And the challenge in the future will be to understand the range of responses that we see. And we can demonstrate a difference from a control treatment, but of course, delivering something that works for the majority of people even will be more challenging.
Well, pardon the pun here, but the mind-blowing thing you're saying is a single dose intervention can have an enduring effect. I can't think of any biological intervention where we can say that. I mean, not certainly not a single infusion of IV ketamine, certainly not one course of ECT and CU. So this is with no maintenance. This is just the enduring effect.
This is an enduring effect that you see in a minority of patients, and I think for the majority, you see an intervention. We've done a limited follow-up on our phase 2 patients. We're doing a much more comprehensive follow-up in phase 3. We'll be able to answer these questions much better in a year or so. But at the moment, we know that maybe 50% of patients within 12 weeks will have some kind of further intervention. Okay. But of the 50% who don't need that, a number of them, a significant number of them, go on and remain extremely well over a prolonged period of follow-up up to 6 months. Now, we imagine that it will be necessary to retreat patients, and that's why we're looking at retreatment in our phase 3 program. And I'll be able to answer this question much more easily in a year or more.
Do you think the FDA is going to ask a lot of questions about that? As well, what happens if someone is starting to show signs of recurrence of symptoms, and do you have enough data from which the average clinician out there is going to be able to know what to do?
Well, the FDA have certainly expressed interest in retreatment. Is one of the points that if you look at the guidance that they've issued so far, which is only at the moment it's consultatory, it's not sort of written in stone because they're learning as we're learning. We're all in this together. They have expressed an interest in just this question of whether you need to retreat and whether retreatment, quote, works. So we will be able to give them data that bears on that question as a result of following people for up to a year, and the frequency with which retreatment may be necessary, likewise.
So I'm sure many of our viewers are asking the question, so who's a candidate and who's not a candidate potentially for psychedelic treatment? Do you have a vision of who is and is not a good candidate?
Well, that's essentially, I think the question you're asking is if I take 100 patients with treatment-resistant depression, who are the 20 I pick out to have the great response?
Why not?
This is the fantasy, of course, of precision
Yes,
medicine,
yes, yes,
precision
yes.
psychiatry, and we're as far from giving you an answer as anybody else with other treatments. We don't really have a clear measure. There's interest in whether there are biomarkers at baseline, whether there are proteins in the blood, proteins in the CSF. There's a lot going on in that space, but we have not been able to generate clear hypotheses from looking at baseline at how patients did with an adequate dose of psilocybin. We don't get a clear story on that. It's not age, it's not duration of illness, it's not clearly the history of the number of tablets that they were taking, the history of the number of medications that they've been taking. So we remain uncertain about that.
Well, let me, if I may, ask about I think, one of the more common negative predictors of outcome in depression trials, which is the history of trauma. And my psychedelic researcher colleagues tell me that they perceive a particular benefit with a psychedelic in patients with a trauma history. Is that accurate? Is that when you come to me with MDD and there's a trauma history, would I be more inclined to think, this might be useful, or is that a factor?
Well, we've had a limited look at the PTSD as a single phenomenon,
Mm-hmm.
uh, essentially not as a comorbidity, I should say, but as PTSD as a result of adult trauma. And we did a
Yeah.
small study, 22 patients, and the results are very good, about 80% remission rate in an open label study. And the follow-up detailed interviews with the patients, extremely encouraging about the way in which patients receive the treatment, the way in which they get better. And the two things very striking. One is that patients can have the trauma recur. The actual index trauma can be something that recurs in the experience under the influence of psilocybin. And it seems to be something that is tolerated by the patient. And about half of the patients, that doesn't happen. And they kind of find an indirect route to feeling better about the trauma. So we're going to learn a lot
Say that
about
again. I'm sorry, that was so important. Say it again.
when you talk to patients about their experience, and we have got to listen to what patients tell us about this treatment. At the moment, we're obsessed by MADRS scores. That's not going to matter in the fullness of time. What we are told by patients is that some of them get the experience, they whatever the trauma was, it sort of comes back in some form under the influence of the drug, and there is some kind of resolution of the kind you might predict. If this was facilitating exposure, if you like, it seems like and this is all the patients expected that. They go
Mhm.
in kind of with that expectation. It's going to come back under the influence of the drug and I'm going to feel differently afterwards. That is true for about half the patients. But for the other half of the patients, that doesn't happen. Other stuff comes up, which is not related directly to the trauma. But at the end of it, they seem to have found an indirect way to resolve their feelings around the traumatic event. So you get an outcome that is good for whatever route you take to some sort of recovery. And a lot of the patients did express that in the follow-up that we did.
That's quite
So
remarkable.
it's going to be really, really interesting to get at this. We're going to have to see whether when you move to complex trauma, when you move to the sort of issues that people have in after military service and so on, who are in the VA system, all of that is going to be discovered. But I have to say that at the moment, we have no reason to think that we should restrict access because of trauma. We should go in and we should assume that it's going to be something that we can research and we can find out the benefit risk balance, and that's going to be part of the future investigation of psilocybin for sure.
I would imagine that to be on the minds of both many patients and potential practitioners who are interested in this technology.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that is very striking is the acuteness of the recovery. So, the if you look at our MADRS scores, they come down kind of immediately in our trials and in other people's trials. And the same is true of the CAPS-5 measures and the more immediate PCL-5 measures that we use to express symptom severity for PTSD. Those changes are very immediate, which is very, very striking and very challenging to how we think about how drugs work, really.
Reason to think that substance use comorbidity that fits the so-called self-medication model might also improve with effective treatment for depression through psilocybin?
We haven't, I mean, one step at a time.
Right.
We're studying depression, not the comorbidities that come with depression, but you're right, of course, to bring them up. I mean, there's been one very well conducted study in the US looking at substance misuse per se, and the results of that were pretty promising. That was delivered in a sense. The psilocybin treatment was succeeded by quite intensive psychotherapy, so that it was, in a sense, truly was a combination of the drug experience and then subsequent psychotherapy, which is a little different from what we've been doing with our patients with depression, who are essentially not getting that kind of psychotherapeutic component. So it'll be interesting to see whether one's dealing with quite the same effect when it comes to substance misuse, and whether we've got comorbidity, you see the same effects acutely that we see on depression for substance misuse. But all of these things are going to be worth looking at because it doesn't look like, the sort of treatment that makes one thing better and the other thing worse. It seems like there's a
Mhm.
transdiagnostic effect that essentially, I mean, Robin Carhart has talked a lot about the sort of relaxing beliefs that, in a sense, one's priors are modified. One can, many of the experience of being a patient is like being a hole in a hole and not being able to stop digging. We've all seen that, and there is a sense in which people are able to stop digging, and that seems to be true, in a number of conditions that we have already studied. And it seems to me a very interesting idea that we've got that kind of treatment to offer to patients in the future.
Um, like many of our listeners, perhaps I've had patients who've used the word microdosing, something I don't quite understand in the world of psychedelics. To me, that's your placebo group. That's the 1 milligram. So, can you share any insights with our listeners as to what if a patient says, "How about if I do this on my own with microdosing? Is that going to have a benefit, or what's that going to do?"
Well, this is an area that where I don't feel qualified to pontificate too much, but we use a single dose as a single microdose as a control treatment for our 25 milligram dose. And
That's
obviously
the
we're
milligram.
looking 25 milligrams. So we're looking to demonstrate a difference between 1 and 25. And that is what we have seen in our studies so far, a difference between 1 and 25. Now, that means that the 1 milligram is effectively a placebo. Um, there is there's a need, I think, for proper trials of microdosing if this is something that is going to be taken seriously by psychopharmacologists. And I think the problem is that where studies have been done carefully, it's usually looked like it's an expectation effect that people go in with high hopes for this treatment, they find reasons to change, and that's a perfectly fine, by the way. Any reason that makes you able to change bad habits and feel better about yourself is fine with me. But the idea that there's a specific sort of sub-threshold microdose pharmacology that is important and replicable as a pharmacological effect, I think so far we don't have any evidence that that is correct. And I would add a further concern that I have is that self-medication with microdosing is often pretty uncertain about what the dose is, and it can become very chronic. And one of the things we know is that exposure to 5-HT agonists can have effects on cardiac function, which are pretty potentially negative. So one wants, and this is in the FDA guidance, that one has to look at, it's the 5-HT2B receptor for the
Mhm.
pharmacological nerds amongst us, but activation of that receptor chronically, even at low dose, potentially could be something that requires toxicity studies at the very least. So, I think it would be very irresponsible for doctors to advocate the use of these medications at even minimal levels of dose, because I don't think we know that it's a completely safe thing to do. Whether it's an effective thing to do is also not established. But I think at this stage, I'm more concerned about the safety angle than the efficacy angle.
Um, Understandably so. Well, before we wrap up, can I just ask you, could you tell us just a bit more about the molecule specifically that Compass is developing? And as people are hearing about other psychedelics, anything that our listeners might want to know, especially about the Compass formulation of psilocybin?
Yeah, well, I mean, psilocybin is historically associated with magic mushrooms, so that's where it comes from. But it was first synthesized in the 1950s by Hoffman, the LSD discoverer. The synthesis that he at Sandoz had was not a particularly stable one. And so the founders of Compass established a new way of synthesizing a stable crystalline version of psilocybin, which is what is the pharmaceutical grade product that we are using. And it has sufficient originality that it has IP around it, which allows us to raise money and to have patents that protect the investigation around it. So that's the molecule. What does it? How long does it last? What does it do? It persists and allows an experience of about 6 to 8 hours. The more intensive bit being the first 3 hours or so. Um, After that time, people can go home, and they don't have to stay for overnight or anything. They're fully recovered by the end of the 8 hours. The peak experience is always described as being quite a gentle one, and the effects that are positive and seem to drive good outcomes really create a greater sense of connectedness for the patient with themselves, if you like, but also with the people around them and the world in general. And that's something that allows people to describe increased meaning in their lives, which seems to be pretty important in depression, as I'm sure all of us who are watching this appreciate. There are some differences from other drugs. LSD lasts for rather much longer, is a little more activating. And the shorter acting drugs give a lot less time for reflection, in that some of them are as short as 15 to 20 minutes. And they produce an experience that's sometimes described as being like shot into space. So one has a sort of complete dissolution of the sense of self. One is sort of kind of distributed across the universe. Dramatic descriptions, but that is what people say. And we're yet to really see full data sets described and analyzed where the kind of advantages and disadvantages of that experience are weighed against the sort of thing that we know happens with either psilocybin or LSD. But those are effectively the three major psychedelic groups that produce an immersive experience, which is driven, I think, by neurobiology as much as anything else.
Some might say that in the case of ketamine, it's a bit of a hit and run drug. You'll have potentially the dissociative experience during the administration, and it's gone. It's not a very long acting drug. And then the antidepressant effects come later. That may be later that day or tomorrow or in a few days, but it's not concurrent with the dissociative experience. Is the same true with psilocybin's antidepressant effects, that we don't necessarily look for those so proximal to the administration?
No, they're pretty much simultaneous with the administration.
Huh.
I mean, people go home and sleep, and then we see them literally the next day. And if you score them on all of our standard mood scales, almost all the patients show quite a big reduction, actually. So it seems to be as immediate and grows out of the experience. You don't really see that delay at all.
Anything fascinating? Anything with a history of psychosis as a relative contraindication? I guess that would depend on what the nature of that psychosis was. But
Yeah, I mean, basically the trials have been very cautious about that, so that we've not recruited people with strong family histories of psychosis. Obviously, there's a sort of recreational literature on the use of drugs, which is not of these class of drugs, which is a little difficult to interpret because you don't really know what the dose or the mixture that people have been taking is. But it does seem like from that recreational literature that people with a strong personal family history of psychosis can be triggered into an episode of psychosis by the actions of this sort of drug. But I think there is a difference. The recreational literature is obviously reflects experience often in less than ideal settings. And we think it's pretty important to have people in a very protected setting, which is quiet, allows contemplation, allows immersion. And that obviously is something that we've striven very hard to produce in the clinical trial settings that we've done. And the impression we get from our numbers of patients who have difficult experiences is that the numbers are quite dramatically reduced in our sort of studies compared to what is reported from recreational studies, although much as it's sometimes quite hard to be sure of what the denominator is in those studies. But, it looks like it's more common when drugs are taken recreationally than when we take them under the conditions that we control. But we will have to see how far we can venture into, for example, bipolar disorder, where obviously depression is such a major challenge for so many patients with bipolar disorder. All we have at the moment is preliminary data in bipolar 2, but obviously, in the fullness of time, we're going to need to understand whether there's any scope for treatment in a broader spread of patients with bipolar disorder.
Do you anticipate the registration packages to the FDA will include bipolar depression as well as unipolar major depression?
Not in the first instance. It's going to be unipolar treatment resistant, and many drugs. If you take, I take a statin. Or rather, I also take an ACE inhibitor. And I remember when I was a medical student, ACE inhibitors were reserved to people with sort of malignant hypertension. and now we're all taking them. So, I think there's a scope. You can imagine that once you prove the value of these medications, they may move towards a broader application. But I can't emphasize enough that I think we start carefully. We have the history of the 1960s. We're not advocating a free-for-all. We're advocating for very careful use. We're advocating reimbursement so that access is fair and equitable. And our objective is not to get this widest possible use of the drugs. Our objective is to get the proper use of the drugs in the right patient population.
And it will be in treatment-resistant depression, not first line.
No, it won't be first line.
Episode. I can keep you here all day, but that would be greedy and selfish. But let me ask one last question. The definition of an adequate trial is always debated in our field. But in the case of ketamine, I remember the early studies looked at, is a single dose sufficient or not? Now the question is, well, is an adequate trial 8 infusions, et cetera? Do you have a definition of an adequate trial for psilocybin? Is it one dose at 25?
No, I don't think so. I mean, one of our trials in phase 3 takes 2 doses.
Okay.
It's looking at 2 25-milligram doses at a 3-week interval. And those patients are also eligible for a third dose if they don't respond. So we're going to get a sense of what an adequate trial is from that data. And my hunch is that it's going to be self-limiting in that I think the patients will essentially have a preference. I mean, that's what the future will be, a mixture of patient preference and also provider preference in how these drugs are used. And we're looking forward to starting to look at that as the drug becomes more easy to prescribe post-approval. That will be the time to answer some of these questions, I think.
And I can think of some patients I know of who assume the response rate is 100%, if not higher. Do we have an estimate of what the likely response rate is from all comers at this point?
I'm going to give a mealy-mouthed response to that. I think we don't know, and it's not a fixed number for everybody. In other words, I think there are some people who are going to remain as tough to treat as they were before they had psilocybin, after psilocybin. And, if that's not true, then my experience as a psychiatrist is worth nothing. There are going to be other people for whom this is actually going to be a real answer. And I met some of those people already who were in the early trials. They have really seen something where they were hopeless. They really didn't think there was much left for them apart from suicide. And they now have a different perspective on their futures. That's very dramatic to see. And it's not something I really associate with the conventional treatments that we've had in my working lifetime. So that's the promise. Delivering it for as many people as possible will be the challenge for medicine. And it's our job to prove that at least that promise is there. And that's where we are at the moment, trying to prove that and to show that the benefits outweigh the undoubted risks that you get of unpleasant effects during the drug and some persisting effects afterwards. And we're describing and quantifying those so that people can understand, what the deal is for them as patients.
So, Guy, now I know why your retirement failed. You discovered something that could have actually meaningfully changed people's lives, and you couldn't resist the opportunity to be part of that process. That's my guess.
It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so I took it.
Well, the world may very, very well find themselves quite grateful for your having forgone the original plan with respect to retirement. This is such important work, and I'm so thrilled that you were able to join us today and give us your firsthand wisdom and insights, not just from the work you've done on psilocybin, but from the more vast backdrop against which you came to this work from your previous efforts in psychopharmacology in a very broad way. So those of us who've known your work for so many years are just very, very happy to see you at the helm with this. So you've been very generous with your time, and I could probably keep you here all day, but I'll turn you loose at this point. Thank you once again for taking the time to speak with us. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
Well, just that it was a pleasure, Joe, particular pleasure to speak to you, and look forward to speaking to you in the future when some of these questions can get a more clear answer than we've been able to give today.
Can't wait. Looking forward to that day sooner than later. I want to thank everybody for joining us today on Brain Trust, Conversations of Psychopharmacology with our guest, my friend and colleague, Dr. Guy Goodwin. Hope you found this helpful, and we'll see you back again soon on Brain Trust. Bye for now.